Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of The Story of Extinct Civilizations of the West by Robert E. Anderson. Chapter 6: Arrival of the Spaniards.
The new birth of the world, which characterized the end of the 15th century, had an enormous influence upon Spain. Her queen, the great Catholic Isabella, had, by assisting Columbus, done much in the great discovery of the Western world. Spain speedily had substantial reward in the boundless wealth poured into her lap, and the rich colonies added to her dominion. Thus, in the beginning of the 16th century, the new consolidated Spain, formed by the union of the two kingdoms, Castile and Aragon, became the richest and greatest of all the European states. The Spanish governors in the West Indies, being ambitious of planting new colonies in the name of the Spanish king, conquest and annexation were stimulated in all directions. When Cuba and Haiti were overrun and annexed to Spain, not without much unjust treatment of the simple natives, as we have seen, they became centers of operation, whence expeditions could be sent to Trinidad or any other island, to Panama, to Yucatan or Florida, or any other part of the continent. After the marvelous experience of Grijalva in Yucatan, then considered an island, and his report that its inhabitants were quite a civilized community compared with the natives of the Isles, Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, resolved at once to invade the new country for purposes of annexation and plunder. Velázquez prepared a large expedition for this adventure, consisting of 11 ships with more than 600 armed men on board, and after much deliberation chose Fernando Cortés to be the commander. Who was this Cortés, destined by his military genius and unscrupulous policy to be comparable to Hannibal or Julius Caesar among the ancients, and to Clive or Napoleon Bonaparte among the moderns? Velázquez knew him well as one of his subordinates in the cruel conquest of Cuba. Before that, Cortés had distinguished himself in Haiti as an energetic and skilled officer. Of an impetuous and fiery temper, which he had learned to keep thoroughly in command, he was characterized by that quality possessed by all commanders of superior genius, the art of gaining the confidence and governing the minds of men. As a youth in Spain, he had studied for the bar at the University of Salamanca, and in some of his speeches on critical occasions one can find certain traces of his academical training in the adroit arguments and clever appeals. Other qualifications as an officer were his manly and handsome appearance, his affable manners, combined with extraordinary address in all martial exercises, and a constitution of such vigor as to be capable of enduring any fatigue. Cortés, on reviewing his commission from the governor, Velázquez, was too shrewd not to be aware of the importance of his new position. The great admiral, with reference to the discovery of the New World, had said, "I have only opened the door for others to enter," and Cortés was conscious that now was the moment for that entrance. Filled with unbounded ambition, he rose to the occasion. Velázquez somewhat hypocritically pretended that the object he had in view was merely barter with the natives of New Spain, that being the name given by Grijalva to Yucatan and the neighboring country. He ordered Cortés, quote, to impress on the natives the grandeur and goodness of his royal master, to invite them to give in their allegiance to him, and to manifest it by regaling him with such comfortable presents of gold, pearls, and precious stones as by showing their own goodwill would secure his favor and protection. Unquote. Mustering his forces for the new expedition, Cortés found that he had no sailors, 553 soldiers, besides 200 Indians of the island, 10 heavy guns, 4 lighter ones called falconets. He had also 16 horses, knowing the effect of even a small body of cavalry in dealing with savages. On February 18, 1519, Cortés sailed with 11 vessels for the coast of Yucatan. Landing at Tabasco, where Grijalva had found the natives friendly, Cortés found that the Yucatans had resolved to oppose him and were presently assembled in great numbers. The result of the fighting, however, was naturally a foregone conclusion, partly on account of the astonishment and terror excited by the destructive effect of the European firearms and the monstrous apparition of men on horseback. Such quadrupeds they had never seen before, and they concluded that the rider with his horse formed one unaccountable animal. Gomara and other chroniclers tell how St. James, the tutelar saint of Spain, appeared in the ranks on a gray horse, and led the Christians to victory over the heathen. An especially fortunate thing for Cortés was that among the female slaves presented after this battle, there was one of remarkable intelligence, who understood both the Aztec and the Mayan languages, and soon learned the Spanish. She proved invaluable to Cortés as an interpreter, and afterward had a share in all his campaigns. She is generally called Marina. If the Spanish accounts are true, stating that the native army consisted of 5 squadrons of 8,000 men each, then this victory is one of the most remarkable on record, as a proof of the value of gunpowder as compared with primitive bows and arrows. To the simple Americans, the terrible invaders seemed actually to wield the thunder and the lightning. Next day, Cortés made an arrangement with the chiefs, and after confidence was restored, asked where they got their gold from. They pointed to the high grounds on the west and said Culua, meaning Mexico. The Palm Sunday being at hand, the conversion of the heathen was duly celebrated by pompous and solemn ceremonial. The army marched in procession with the priests at their head, accompanied by crowds of Indians of both sexes, till they reached the principal temple. A new altar being built, the image of the presiding deity was taken from its place and thrown down, to make room for that of the Virgin carrying the infant Savior. Cortés now learned that the capital of the Mexican Empire was on the mountain plains nearly 70 leagues inland, and that the ruler was the great and powerful Montezuma. It was on the morning of Good Friday that Cortés landed on the site of Veracruz, which after the conquest of Mexico speedily grew into a flourishing seaport, becoming the commercial capital of New Spain. A friendly conference took place between Cortés and Totlil, an Aztec chief, who asked from what country the strangers had come and why they had come. "I am a servant," replied Cortés, "of a mighty monarch beyond the seas, who rules over an immense empire, having kings and princes for his vassals. Since my master has heard of the greatness of the Mexican emperor, he has desired me to enter into communication with him, and has sent me as envoy to wait upon Montezuma, with a present in token of goodwill, and with a message which I must deliver in person. When can I be admitted to your sovereign's presence?" The Aztec chief replied with an air of dignity, "How is it that you have been here only 2 days and demand to see the emperor? If there is another monarch as powerful as Montezuma, I have no doubt my master will be happy to interchange courtesies." The slaves of Tutlile presented to Cortés 10 loads of fine cotton, several mantles of that curious featherwork whose rich and delicate dyes might vie with the most beautiful painting, and a wicker basket filled with ornaments of wrought gold, all calculated to inspire the Spaniards with high ideas of the wealth and mechanical ingenuity of the Mexicans. Having duly expressed his thanks, Cortés then laid before the Aztec chief the presents intended for Montezuma. These were an armchair richly carved and painted, a crimson cap bearing a gold medal emblazoned with St. George and the dragon, collars, bracelets, and other ornaments of cut glass, which, in a country where glass was unknown, might claim to have the value of real gems. During the interview, Tutlal had been curiously observing a shining gilt helmet worn by a soldier, and said that it was exactly like that of Quetzalcoatl. "Who is he?" asked Cortés. "Quetzalcoatl is the god about whom the Aztecs have the prophecy that he will come back to them across the sea." Cortés promised to send the helmet to Montezuma, and expressed a wish that it would be returned filled with the gold dust of the Aztecs, that he might compare it with the Spanish gold dust. One reporter who was present says, "He further told Governor Totlili that the Spaniards were troubled with a disease of the heart, for which gold was a specific remedy." Another incident of this notable interview was that one of the Mexican attendants was observed by Cortés to be scribbling with a pencil. It was an artist sketching the appearance of the strangers, their dress, arms, and attitude, and filling in the picture with touches of color. Struck with the idea of being thus represented to the Mexican monarch, Cortés ordered the cavalry to be exercised on the beach in front of the artists. Quote, "The bold and rapid movements of the troops, the apparent ease with which they managed the fiery animals on which they were mounted, the glancing of their weapons, and the shrill cry of the trumpet, all filled the spectators with astonishment. But when they heard the thunders of the cannon, which Cortés ordered to be fired at the same time, and witnessed the volumes of smoke and flame issuing from these terrible engines, and the rushing sound of the balls, as they dashed through the trees of the neighboring forest, shivering their branches into fragments, they were filled with consternation and wonder, from which the Aztec chief himself was not wholly free." Unquote. This was all faithfully copied by the picture writers so far as their art went, in sketching and vivid coloring. They also recorded the ships of the strangers, the water houses, as they were named, whose dark hulls and snow-white sails were swinging at anchor in the bay. Meantime, what had Montezuma been doing, the sad-faced and haughty emperor of Mexico, land of the Aztecs and the Tezcucans? At the beginning of his reign, he had as a skillful general led his armies as far as Honduras and Nicaragua, extending the limits of the empire so that it had now reached the maximum. Tezcuco, the sister state to Mexico, had latterly shown hostility to Montezuma, and still more formidable was the Republic of Tlaxcala, lying between his capital and the coast. Prodigies and prophecies now began to affect all classes of the population in the Mexican Valley. Everybody spoke of the return from over the sea of the popular god Quetzalcoatl, the fair-skinned and long-haired. A generation had already elapsed since the first rumors that white men in great mysterious vessels, bearing in their hands the thunder and lightning, were seizing the islands and must soon seize the mainland. No wonder that Montezuma, stern, tyrannical, and disappointed, should be dismayed at the news of Grijalva's landing, and still more so when hearing of the fleet and army of Cortés, and seeing their horsemen pictured by his artists, the whole accompanied by exaggerated accounts of the guns and cannon able to produce thunder and lightning. After holding a council, Montezuma resolved to send an embassy to Cortés, presenting him with a present which should reflect the incomparable grandeur and resources of Mexico, and at the same time forbidding an approach to the capital. The governor Toitle, on this second embassy, was accompanied by 2 Aztec nobles and 100 slaves, bearing the present from Montezuma to Cortés. As they entered the pavilion of the Spanish general, the air was filled with clouds of incense which rose from censers carried by some attendants. Quote, "Some delicately wrought mats were then unrolled, and on them the slaves displayed the various articles, shields, helmets, cuirasses, embossed with plates and ornaments of pure gold, collars and bracelets of the same metal, sandals, fans, and crests of variegated feathers, intermingled with gold and silver thread, and sprinkled with pearls and precious stones, imitations of birds and animals in wrought and cast gold and silver of exquisite workmanship, curtains, coverlets, and robes of cotton, fine as silk, of rich and various dyes interwoven with feather work that rivaled the delicacy of painting. The things which excited most admiration were 2 circular plates of gold and silver, as large as carriage wheels. One representing the sun was richly carved with plants and animals. It was 30 palms in circumference, and was worth about 52,500 pounds sterling." Unquote. Cortés was interested in seeing the soldier's helmet brought back to him full to the brim with grains of gold. The courteous message from Montezuma, however, did not please him much. Montezuma excused himself from having a personal interview by the distance being too great, and the journey beset with difficulties and dangers from formidable enemies. All that could be done, therefore, was for the strangers to return to their own land. Soon after, Cortés, by a species of statecraft, formed a new municipality, thus transforming his camp into a civil community. The name of the new city was Villa Rica de Veracruz, i.e., the rich town of the True Cross. Once the municipality was formed, Cortés resigned before them his office of Captain General, and thus became free from the authority of Velázquez. The city council at once chose Cortés to be Captain General and Chief Justice of the colony. He could now go forward unchecked by any superior except the crown. It was a desperate undertaking to climb with an army from the hot region of this flat coast through the varied succession of slopes which form the temperate region, and at last, on the high tableland, obtain entrance upon the great enclosed valley of Mexico. Cortés found that an essential preliminary was to gain the friendship of the Totonacs, a nation tributary to Montezuma. Their subjection to the Aztecs he had already verified, since one day when holding a conference with the Totonac leaders and a neighboring cacique, i.e., prince, Cortés saw 5 men of haughty appearance enter the marketplace, followed by several attendants, and at once received the politest attention from the Totonacs. Cortés asked Marina, his slave interpreter, who or what they were. "They are Aztec nobles," she replied, "sent by Montezuma to receive tribute." Presently the Totonac chiefs came to Cortés with looks of dire dismay to inform him of the great emperor's resentment at the entertainment offered to the Spaniards, and demanding in expiation 20 young men and women for sacrifice to the Aztec gods. Cortés, with every look of indignation, insisted that the Totonacs should not only refuse to comply, but should seize the Aztec messengers and hold them strictly confined in prison. Unscrupulous to gain his ends, Cortés by lies and cunning duplicity managed to set the Mexican nobles free, dismissing them with a friendly message to Montezuma, while at the same time securing the confidence of the simple-minded Totonacs, urging them to join the Spaniards and make a bold effort to regain their independence. Some thought that Cortés was really the kindly divinity Quetzalcoatl, promised by the prophets to bring freedom and happiness. As an instance of the religious enthusiasm of the Spanish invaders, we may give the account of the conversion of Zempoalla, a city in the Totonac district. When Cortés pressed upon the cacique of Zempoalla that his mission was to turn the Indians from the abominations of their present religion, that prince replied that he could not accept what the Spanish priests had told him about the creator and ruler of the universe, especially that he ever stooped to become a mere man, weak and poor, so as to suffer voluntarily persecution and even death at the hands of some of his own creatures. The cacique added that he would resist any violence offered to his gods, who would indeed avenge the act themselves by the instant destruction of their enemies. Cortés and his men seized the opportunity. There is no doubt that, after witnessing some of the barbarous sacrifices of human victims followed by cannibal feasts, their souls had naturally been sickened. They now proceeded to force the work of conversion as soon as Cortés had appealed to them and declared that God and the holy saints would never favor their enterprise if such atrocities were allowed, and that for his own part he was resolved the Indian idols should be demolished that very hour if it cost him his life. Scarcely waiting for his commands, the Spaniards moved toward one of the principal teocallis, or temples, which rose high on a pyramidal foundation with a steep ascent of stone steps in the middle. The cacique, divining their purpose, instantly called his men to arms. The Indian warriors gathered from all quarters, with shrill cries and clashing of weapons, while the priests, in their dark cotton robes, with disheveled tresses matted with blood, rushed frantic among the natives, calling on them to protect their gods from violation. All was now confusion and tumult. Cortés took his usual prompt measures. Causing the cacique and some of the principal citizens and priests to be arrested, he commanded them to quiet the people, declaring that if a single arrow was shot against a Spaniard, it should cost every one of them his life. The cacique covered his face with his hands, exclaiming that the gods would avenge their own wrongs. The Christians were not slow in availing themselves of his tacit acquiescence. 50 soldiers, at a signal from their general, sprang up the great stairway of the temple, entered the building on the summit, the walls of which were black with human gore, and dragged the huge wooden idols to the edge of the terrace. Their fantastic forms and features, conveying a symbolic meaning which was lost on the Spaniards, seemed to their eyes only the hideous lineaments of Satan. With great alacrity they rolled the colossal monsters down the steps of the pyramid, amid the triumphant shouts of their own companions and the groans and lamentations of the natives. They then consummated the whole by burning them in the presence of the assembled multitude. After the temple had been cleansed from every trace of the idol worship and its horrors, a new altar was raised, surmounted by a lofty cross and hung with garlands of roses. A reaction having now set in among the Indians, many were willing to become Christians, and some of the Aztec priests even joined in a procession to signify their conversion, wearing white robes instead of their former dark mantles, and carrying lighted candles in their hands, while an image of the Virgin half smothered under the weight of flowers was borne aloft and, as the procession climbed the steps of the temple, was deposited above the altar. The impressive character of the ceremony and the passionate eloquence of the good priest touched the feelings of the motley audience, until Indians as well as Spaniards, if we may trust the chronicler, were melted into tears and audible sobs. Before finally marching westward toward the temperate slopes of the mountains, Cortés had another opportunity of proving his generalship and prompt resource at a critical moment. When Agathocles, the autocratic ruler of Syracuse, sailed over to defeat the Carthaginians, the first thing he did on landing in Africa was to burn his ships, that his soldiers might have no opportunity of retreat and no hope but in victory. Cortés now acted on exactly the same principle. After discovering that a number of his soldiers had formed a conspiracy to seize one of the ships and sail to Cuba, Cortés, on conviction, punished 2 of the ringleaders with death. Soon after, he formed the extraordinary resolution of destroying his ships without the knowledge of his army. The 5 worst ships were first ordered to be dismantled, and soon after to be sunk. When the rest were inspected, 4 of them were condemned in the same manner. When the news reached Zempoala, the army were excited almost to open mutiny. Cortés, however, was perfectly cool. Addressing the army collectively, he assured them that the ships were not fit for service, as had been shown by due inspection. There is one important advantage gained to the army, viz., the addition of 100 able-bodied recruits who were necessary to man the lost ships. Besides all that, of what use could ships be to us in the present expedition? As for me, I will remain here even without a comrade. As for those who shrink from the dangers of our glorious enterprise, let them go back, in God's name. Let them go home, since there is still one vessel left. Let them go on board and return to Cuba. They can tell how they deserted their commander and their comrades, and patiently wait till they see us return loaded with the spoils of the Aztecs. Persuasion is the end of true oratory. The reply of the army to Cortés was the unanimous shout, "To Mexico! To Mexico!" After beginning the gradual ascent in their march toward the tableland of Mexico, the first place noted by the invaders was Jalapa, a town which still retains its Aztec name, known to all the world by the well-known drug grown there. It is a favorite resort of the wealthier residents in Veracruz, and that too tropical plain which Cortés had just left. The mighty mountain Orizaba, one of the guardians of the Mexican Valley, is now full in sight, towering in solitary grandeur with its robe of snow. At last, they reached a town so populous that there were 13 Aztec temples with the usual sacrificial stone for human victims before each idol. In the suburbs, the Spanish were shocked by a gathering of human skulls, many thousand in number. This appalling reminder of the unspeakable sacrifices soon became a familiar sight as they marched through that country. Cortés asked the cacique if he were subject to Montezuma. "Who is there?" replied the local prince. "That is not tributary to that emperor?" "I am not," said the stranger general. Cortés assured him that the monarch whom the Spaniards served had princes as vassals, who were more powerful than the Aztec ruler. The cacique said, "Montezuma could muster 30 great vassals, each master of 100,000 men. His revenues were incalculable, since every subject, however poor, paid something. More than 20,000 victims, the fruit of his wars, were annually sacrificed on the altars of his gods. His capital stood on a lake in the center of a spacious valley. The approach to the city was by means of causeways several miles long, and when the connecting bridges were raised, all communication with the country was cut off. The Indians showed the greatest curiosity respecting the dresses, weapons, horses, and dogs of their strange visitors. The country all around was then well wooded and full of villages and towns, which disappeared after the conquest. Humboldt remarked, when he traveled there, that the whole district had, at the time of the arrival of the Spanish, been more inhabited and better cultivated, and that in proportion as they got higher up near the tableland, they found the villages more frequent, the fields more subdivided, and the people more law-abiding. Before entering upon the tableland, Cortés resolved to visit the Republic of Tlaxcala, which was noted for having retained its independence in spite of the Aztecs. After sending an embassy, consisting of the 4 chief Zempoalas, who had accompanied the army, he set out toward Tlaxcala, lingering as they proceeded, so that his ambassadors should have time to return. While wondering at the delay, they suddenly reached a remarkable fortification which marked the limits of the Republic and acted as a barrier against the Mexican invasions. Prescott thus describes it: a stone wall 9 feet in height and 20 in thickness, with a parapet a 1.5 feet broad, raised on the summit for the protection of those who defended it. It had only one opening in the center, made by 2 semicircular lines of wall overlapping each other for the space of 40 paces, and affording a passageway between 10 paces wide, so contrived, therefore, as to be perfectly commanded by the inner wall. This fortification, which extended more than 2 leagues, rested at either end on the bold natural buttresses formed by the Sierra. The work was built of immense blocks of stone nicely laid together without cement, and the remains still existing, among which are rocks of the whole breadth of the rampart, fully attest its solidity and size." Unquote. Who were the people of this stout-hearted republic? The Tlaxcalans were a kindred tribe to the Aztecs, and after coming to the Mexican Valley toward the close of the 12th century, had settled for many years on the western shore of Lake Texcoco. Afterward, they migrated to that district of fruitful valleys where Cortés found them, Tlaxcala, meaning land of bread. They then, as a nation, consisted of 4 separate states, considerably civilized, and always able to protect their confederacy against foreign invasion. Their arts, religion, and architecture were the same as those of the Aztecs and Texcoocans. More than once had the Aztecs attempted to bring the little republic into subjection, but in vain. In one campaign, Montezuma had lost a favorite, besides having his army defeated, and though a much more formidable invasion followed, the bold mountaineers withdrew into the recesses of their hills, and coolly watching their opportunity, rushed like a torrent on the invaders, and drove them back with dreadful slaughter from their territories. The Tlaxcalans had of course heard of the redoubtable Europeans and their advance upon Montezuma's kingdom, but not expecting any visit themselves, they were in doubt about the embassy sent by Cortés, and the council had not reached a decision when the arrival of Cortés was announced at the head of his cavalry. Attacked by a body of several thousand Indians, he sent back a horseman to make the infantry hurry up to his assistance. 2 of the horses were killed, a loss seriously felt by Cortés, but when the main body had discharged a volley from their muskets and crossbows, so astounded were the Tlaxcalan Indians that they stopped fighting and withdrew from the field. Next morning, after Cortés had given careful instruction to his army, now more than 3,000 in number, with his Indian auxiliaries, they had not marched far when they were met by 2 of the Zempoalians, who had been sent as ambassadors. They informed Cortés that as captives they had been reserved for the sacrificial stone, but had succeeded in breaking out of prison. They also said that forces were being collected from all quarters to meet the Spaniards. At the first encounter, the Indians, after some spirited fighting, retreated in order to draw the Spanish army into a defile impracticable for artillery or cavalry. Pressing forward, they found, on turning an abrupt corner of the glen, that an army of many thousands was drawn up in order, prepared to receive them. As they came into view, the Tlaxcalans set up a piercing war cry, shrill and hideous, accompanied by the melancholy beat of 1,000 drums. Cortés spurred on the cavalry to force a passage for the infantry, and kept exhorting his soldiers while showing them an example of personal daring. "If we fail now," he cried, "the cross of Christ can never be planted in this land. Forward, comrades! When was it ever known that a Castilian turned his back on a foe?" With desperate efforts, the soldiers forced a passage through the Indian columns, and then, as soon as the horse opened room for the movements of the gunners, the terrible thunder and lightning of the cannon did the rest. The havoc caused in their ranks, combined with the roar and the flash of gunpowder and the mangled carcasses, filled the whole of the barbarian army with horror and consternation. 8 leaders of the Tlaxcalan army having fallen, the prince ordered a retreat. The chief of the Tlaxcalans, Xicotencatl, was no ordinary leader. When Cortés wished to press on to the capital, he sent 2 envoys to the Tlaxcalan camp, But all that Xicotencatl deigned to reply was, quote, that the Spaniards might pass on as soon as they chose to Tlaxcala, and when they reached it their flesh would be hewn from their bodies for sacrifice to the gods. If they preferred to remain in their own quarters, he would pay them a visit there the next day. Unquote. The envoys also told Cortés that the chief had now collected another very large army, 5 battalions of 10,000 men each. There was evidently a determination to try the fate of Tlaxcala by a pitched battle and exterminate the bold invaders. The next day, September 5th, 1519, was therefore a critical one in the annals of Cortés. He resolved to meet the Tlaxcalan chief in the field, after directing the foot soldiers to use the point of their swords and not the edge, the horse to charge at half speed, directing their lances at the eyes of their enemies, the gunners and crossbowmen to support each other, some loading while others were discharging their pieces. Before Cortés and his soldiers had marched a mile, they saw the immense Tlaxcalan army, stretched far and wide over a vast plain. Nothing could be more picturesque than the aspect of these Indian battalions, with the naked bodies of the common soldiers gaudily painted, the fantastic helmets of the chiefs bright with ornaments and precious stones, and the glowing panoplies of featherwork. Quote, the golden glitterance and the feather mail, more gay than glittering gold, and round the helm a coronal of high upstanding plumes. With war songs and wild music they came on. Unquote. The Tlaxcalan warriors had attained wonderful skill in throwing the javelin. One species, with a thong attached to it which remained in the slinger's hand, that he might recall the weapon, was especially dreaded by the Spaniards. Their various weapons were pointed with bone or obsidian, and sometimes headed with copper. The yell or scream of defiance raised by these Indians almost drowned the volume of sound from the wild barbaric minstrelsy of shell, atabal, and trumpet with which they proclaimed their triumphant anticipations of victory over the paltry forces of the invaders. Advancing under a thick shower of arrows and other missiles, the Spanish soldiers at a certain distance quickly halted and drew up in order, before delivering a general fire along the whole line. The front ranks of their wild opponents were mowed down, and those behind were petrified with dismay. But for the accident of dissension having arisen between the chiefs of the Tlaxcalans, it almost seemed as if nothing could have saved Cortés and his Spanish army. Before the battle, the haughty treatment of one of those chiefs by Xicotencatl, the cacique, provoked the injured man to draw off all his contingent during the battle, and persuade another chief to do the same. With his forces so weakened, the cacique was compelled to resign the field to the Spaniards. Xicotencatl, in his eagerness for revenge, consulted some of the Aztec priests who recommended a night attack upon Cortés's camp in order to take his army by surprise. The Tlaxcalan, therefore, with 10,000 warriors, marched secretly toward the Spanish camp, but owing to the bright moonlight, they were not unseen by the vedettes. Besides that, Cortés had accustomed his army to sleep with their arms by their side and the horses ready saddled. In an instant, as it were, the whole camp were on the alert and under arms. The Indians, meanwhile, were stealthily advancing to the silent camp, and no sooner had they reached the slope of the rising ground than they were astounded by the deep battle cry of the Spaniards, followed by the instantaneous appearance of the whole army. Scarcely awaiting the shock of their enemy, the panic-struck barbarians fled rapidly and tumultuously across the plain. The horse easily overtook the fugitives, riding them down and cutting them to pieces without mercy. Next day, Cortés sent new ambassadors to the Tlaxcalan capital, accompanied by his faithful slave interpreter, Marina. They found the cacique's council sad and dejected, every gleam of hope being now extinguished. The message of Cortés still promised friendship and pardon if only they agreed to act as allies. If the present offer were rejected, he would visit their capital as a conqueror, raze every house to the ground, and put every inhabitant to the sword. On hearing this ultimatum, the council chose 4 leading chiefs to be entrusted with a mission to Cortés, assuring him of a free passage through the country and a friendly reception in the capital. The ambassadors, on their way back to Cortés, called at the camp of Xicotencatl and were there detained by him. He was still planning against the terrible invaders. Cortés, in the meantime, had another opportunity of showing his resource and presence of mind. Some of his soldiers had shown a grumbling discontent. The idea of conquering Mexico was madness. If they had encountered such opposition from the petty republic, what might they not expect from the great Mexican Empire? There was now a temporary suspension of hostilities. Should they not avail themselves of it to retrace their steps to Vera Cruz? To this Cortés listened calmly and politely, replying that he had told them at the outset that glory was to be won only by toil and danger. He had never shrunk from his share of both. To go back now was impossible. What would the Tlaxcalans say? How would the Mexicans exult at such a miserable issue? Instead of turning your eyes toward Cuba, fix them on Mexico, the great object of our enterprise. Many other soldiers having gathered round, the mutinous party took courage to say that another such victory as the last would be their ruin. They were going to Mexico only to be slaughtered. With some impatience, Cortés gaily quoted a soldier's song, "Better die with honor than live in long disgrace," a sentiment which the majority of the audience naturally cheered to the echo, while the malcontents slunk away to their quarters. The next event was the arrival of some Tlaxcalans wearing white badges as an indication of peace. They brought a message, they said, from Xicotencatl, who now desired an arrangement with Cortés and would soon appear in person. Most of them remained in the camp, where they were treated kindly, but Marina, with her woman's wit, became somewhat suspicious of them. Perhaps some of them, forgetting that she knew their language, let drop a phrase in talking to each other, which awoke her distrust. She told Cortés that the men were spies. He had them arrested and examined separately, ascertaining in that way that they were sent to obtain secret information of the Spanish camp, and that in fact Xicotencatl was mustering his forces to make another determined attack on the invading army. To show the fierceness of his resentment at such treatment, Cortés ordered the 50 spy ambassadors to have their hands hacked off and sent back to tell their lord that the Tlaxcalans might come by day or night, they would find the Spaniards ready for them. The sight of their mutilated comrades filled the Indian camp with dread and horror. All thoughts of resistance to the advance of Cortés were now abandoned, and not long after the arrival of Xicotencatl himself was announced, attended by a numerous train. He advanced with the firm and fearless step of one who was coming rather to bid defiance than to sue for peace. He was rather above the middle size, with broad shoulders and a muscular frame, intimating great activity and strength. He made the usual salutation by touching the ground with his hand and carrying it to his head. He threw no blame on the Tlaxcalan Senate, but assumed all the responsibility of the war. He admitted that the Spanish army had beaten him, but hoped they would use their victory with moderation and not trample on the liberties of the Republic. Cortés admired the cazique's lofty spirit, while pretending to rebuke him for having so long remained an enemy. He was willing to bury the past in oblivion and to receive the Tlaxcalans as vassals to the emperor, his master. Before the entry into Tlaxcala, the capital, there arrived an embassy from Montezuma, who had been keenly disappointed, no doubt, that Cortés had not only not been defeated by the bravest race on the Mexican tableland, but had formed a friendly alliance with them. As Cortés, with his army, approached the populous city, they were welcomed by great crowds of men and women in picturesque dresses, with nosegays and wreaths of flowers, priests in white robes and long matted tresses swinging their burning censers of incense. The anniversary of this entry into Tlaxcala, September 23, 1519, is still celebrated as a day of rejoicing. Cortés, in his letter to the Emperor, King of Spain, compares it for size and appearance to Granada, the Moorish capital. Pottery was one of the industries in which Tlaxcala excelled. The Tlaxcalan was chiefly agricultural in his habits. His honest breast glowed with the patriotic attachment to the soil, which is the fruit of its diligent culture, while he was elevated by that consciousness of independence which is the natural birthright of a child of the mountains. Cholula, capital of the republic of that name, is 6 leagues north of Tlaxcala and about 20 southeast of Mexico. In the time of the conquest of the tableland of Anahuac, as the whole district is sometimes termed, this city was large and populous. The people excelled in mechanical arts, especially metalworking, cloth weaving, and a delicate kind of pottery. Reference has already been made to the god Quetzalcoatl, in whose honor a huge pyramid was erected here. From the farthest parts of Anahuac, devotees thronged to Cholula, just as the Mohammedans to Mecca. The Spaniards found the people of Cholula superior in dress and looks to any of the races they had seen. The higher classes wore fine embroidered mantles resembling the Moorish cloak in texture and fashion. They showed the same delicate taste for flowers as the other tribes of the plateau, tossing garlands and bunches among the soldiers. The Spaniards were also struck with the cleanliness of the city, the regularity of the streets, the solidity of the houses, and the number and size of the pyramidal temples. After being treated with kindness and hospitality for several days, all at once the scene changed, the cause being the arrival of messengers from Montezuma. At the same time, some Tlaxcalans told Cortés that a great sacrifice, mostly of children, had been offered to propitiate the favor of the gods. At this juncture, Marina, the Indian slave interpreter, again proved to be the good angel of Cortés. She had become very friendly with the wife of one of the Cholula caciques, who gave her a hint that there was danger in staying at the house of any Spaniard, and when further pressed by Marina, said that the Spaniards were to be slaughtered when marching out of the capital. The plot had originated with the Aztec emperor, and 20,000 Mexicans were already quartered a little distance out of town. In this most critical position, Cortés at once decided to take possession of the great square, placing a strong guard at each of its 3 gates of entrance. The rest of what troops he had in the town he posted without with the cannon to command the avenues. He had already sent orders to the Tlaxcalan chiefs to keep their soldiers in readiness to march, at a given signal, into the city to support the Spaniards. Presently, the caciques of Cholula arrived with a larger body of levies than Cortés had demanded. He at once charged them with conspiring against the Spaniards after receiving them as friends. They were so amazed at his discovery of their perfidy that they confessed everything, laying the blame on Montezuma. "That pretense," said Cortés, assuming a look of fierce indignation, "is no justification. I shall now make such an example of you for your treachery that the report of it will ring throughout the wide borders of Anahuac." At the firing of a harquebus, the fatal signal, the crowd of unsuspecting Cholulans were massacred as they stood, almost without resistance. Meantime, the other Indians without the square commenced an attack on the Spaniards, but the heavy guns of the battery played upon them with murderous effect, and cavalry advanced to support the attack. The steeds, the guns, the weapons of the Spaniards were all new to the Cholulans. Notwithstanding the novelty of the terrific spectacle, the flash of arms mingling with the deafening roar of the artillery, the desperate Indians pushed on to take the places of their fallen comrades. While this scene of bloodshed was progressing, the Tlaxcalans, as arranged, were hastening to the assistance of their Spanish allies. The Cholulans, when thus attacked in rear by their traditional enemies, speedily gave way and tried to save themselves in the great temple and elsewhere. The Holy City, as it was called, was converted into a pandemonium of massacre. In memory of the signal defeat of the Cholulans, Cortés converted the chief part of the great temple into a Christian church. Envoys again arrived from Mexico with rich presents and a message vindicating the pusillanimous emperor from any share in the conspiracy against Cortés. Continuing their march, the allied army of Spaniards and Tlaxcalans proceeded till they reached the mountains which separate the tableland of Puebla from that of Mexico. To cross this range, they followed the route which passes between the mighty Popocatépetl, i.e., the Smoking Mountain, and another called the White Woman, from its broad robe of snow. The first lies about 40 miles southeast of the capital, to which their march was directed. It is more than 2,000 feet higher than Mont Blanc, and has 2 principal craters, one of which is about 1,000 feet deep and has large deposits of sulfur which are regularly mined. Popocatépetl has long been only a quiescent volcano, but during the invasion by Cortés it was often burning, especially at the time of the siege of Tlaxcala. That was naturally interpreted all over the district of Anahuac to be a bad omen, associated with the landing and approach of the Spaniards. Cortés insisted on several descents being made into the great crater till sufficient sulfur was collected to supply gunpowder to his army. The icy cold winds, varied by storms of snow and sleet, were more trying to the Europeans than the Tlaxcalans. But some relief was found in the stone shelters which had been built at certain intervals along the roads for the accommodation of couriers and other travelers. At last they reached the crest of the sierra which unites Popocatépetl, the great volcan, to its sister mountain, the Woman in White. Soon after, at a turning of the road, the invaders enjoyed their first view of the famous Valley of Mexico, or Tenochtitlan, with its beautiful lakes in their setting of cultivated plains, here and there varied by woods and forests. In the midst, like some Indian empress with her coronal of pearls, the fair city, with her white towers and pyramidal temples, reposing as it were on the bosom of the waters, the far-famed Venice of the Aztecs. This view of the Promised Land will remind some of the picturesque account given by Livy of Hannibal, reaching the top of the pass over the Alps and pointing out the fair prospect of Italy to his soldiers. We may thus render the passage: on the 9th day, the ridge of the Alps was reached, over ground, generally trackless and by roundabout ways. The order for marching being given at break of day, the army were sluggishly advancing over ground, wholly covered with snow, listlessness and despair depicted on the features of all. Hannibal went on in front, and after ordering the soldiers to halt on a height which commanded a distant view, far and wide, points out to them Italy and the plains of Lombardy on both banks of the Po, at the foot of the Alps, telling them that at that moment they were crossing not only the walls of Italy, but of the Roman capital, that the rest of the march was easy and downhill. The situation of Hannibal and his Carthaginians surveying Italy for the first time is in some respects closely analogous to that of Cortés, pointing out the Valley of Mexico to his Spanish soldiers.
This concludes today's reading of the story of extinct civilizations of the West by Robert E. Anderson. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Antonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.